The date is June 6, 1944. Around 1,600,000 troops, 5,000 warships, and 13,000 aircraft are landing at Normandy to begin an operation now known as D-Day. D-Day is probably the most iconic event in the Second World War and begun the liberation of France. But there is a side of D-Day that is seldom remembered. A resistance force that destroyed crucial railroads and telephone communication lines caused chaos among the German forces. They were active throughout the Allied campaign of France and were one of the many factors that led to the liberation of Paris and eventually the end of the war. Without them, the Allies would have to face a much more organized, supplied, and armed German army. These men and women are simply known as the French Resistance. The French resistance was a major triumph for France because it shows how a small but organized group of people can still be very effective when against a large military power. The French resistance is also tragic due to its very existence. This is because it was created from the fall of France, a tragedy that the French can never forget. But who were the French resistance? And how were they formed? And what exactly did they do? It all started on June 22nd, 1940. The French government has surrendered. Hitler accepted the surrender in the same train carriage that ended the First World War. A brutal insult. The French government signed an armistice with the Germans and insist that this is the only thing that they can do to save their people. The armistice splits France in half, one being controlled by the Germans, the other by the Vichy government. The Vichy government was just a puppet, which the Germans used to pass laws and broadcast propaganda. Just before this, on June 18th, 1940, Charles de Gaulle gave his Appeal of 18th June, a famous speech that rallied the people to fight. Charles de Gaulle rallied the French people to fight and invited all remaining French soldiers or armed citizens to come to Britain and form a resistance group. 8,000 people answered his call, a start for what will eventually become the Free French. In France, the French people began to resent German rule in the Vichy government. This resentment was amplified by Charles de Gaulle's speech, which filled the French people with a burning desire to destroy German rule of France. This desire became action as resistance groups began to pop up. Some groups were passive, who printed anti-German newspapers, but most of the groups were Maquis. Those groups tried to hurt or even kill German officers, and on August 21st, 1941, a German officer was shot in a subway in France, killing him, the first victim of the resistance. Hitler responded with great frustration. He ordered the mass execution of 150 Parisians, most of them being Jewish. The early resistance only provoked vengeance in the Germans, and did very little to weaken the German army. The resistance needed to find a way to hurt the Germans, but also not suffer much retaliation. This is when the resistance fighters realized something. The German forces required tons of resources to fuel their weapons. To do this, they started to use France's industrial might to power their army and impose strict rations on the French population. Factories, railroads, and other types of infrastructure was the key to German power. Logically, it became the new target of the resistance. Destroy all the infrastructure under the control of the Germans. If they do not hurt any German people during the attacks, Hitler's harshest retaliations never came. Resistance has found their target, but needs the Allies to help them, as what good is resistance if the major players of the war cannot take advantage of their presence? Luckily, Britain began to parachute agents into France. These agents created resistance groups or linked up with existing resistance groups. These agents were supposed to use a radio to communicate over the English Channel with Britain. However, radios that can broadcast over the English Channel were very rare, so a radio station named Radio Londres was called in to help. Radio Londres was a French radio station based in Britain. It was created for the sole purpose of countering German propaganda. Its job was to broadcast personal messages that were codes for the resistance. These messages were broadcasted before and after regular programming. The messages were a jumbled mess of phrases, and it made it very hard to decipher what was actually being communicated. A message such as,
Je n'aime pas les crêpes Suzette,
may be a signal that the resistance needed supplies. The French resistance then went to a predetermined location and helped deliver the supplies by shining flashlights to signal the supply trains or loading them up onto trucks. But who was broadcasting these codes? Well, his name was Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle was a very important leader in the French resistance. When the French government surrendered and became the Vichy government, Charles de Gaulle fled to London. Before, he was appointed as Under-Secretary of State for Defense and War for only 10 days. He was also a tank division commander for the French army. And on June 18, 1940, he broadcasted his most famous speech via Radio Londres. It called the French people to action, and he continued to speak on Radio Londres until France was liberated. In that speech, he rallied the remaining soldiers from the German invasion to come to London and form a new resistance group. This group will go on to become the Free French. The Free French started out small, weak, and unknown. Charles de Gaulle knew this and wanted to win the support of America and Great Britain. He also needed to organize the resistance groups in France into one single entity. So, he started to push himself as the leader of France, getting the Allies to treat his new resistance movement as a partner in the war effort. He appointed a leader named Jean Moulin, who set up a huge network of resistance members and organized them. By now, he had accumulated 100,000 members, and the Allies took note. British agents began to open communications with Charles de Gaulle. They merged their networks, boosting resistance numbers even farther. Although the agents did not completely trust de Gaulle, they informed him of the upcoming Allied invasion. Its name, Operation Overlord, also known as D-Day. Together, British agents formed a plan with de Gaulle. When the signal is given, the resistance member will take out telephone lines, railroads, and utilities to sabotage the Germans and slow their response, and intercept and hold off tank divisions. The resistance now have their target. Now, it was time to destroy it. June 5th, 1944. Resistance members huddle around radios all over France, listening. 5 minutes before midnight, they hear it.
les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne bercent mon cœur d'une langueur monotone.
It is a line torn straight from a French poem. It signals the beginning of D-Day. A cheer goes up in the crowd, and they grab their weapons, explosives, and flashlights and spread out to complete their work. They work day and night. and over the course of a day, the resistance fighters destroyed 577 railroads, 20 driving roads, and 32 telecommunication lines. Then, they slowed the German pursuit by cutting off and attacking several tank divisions, slowing the initial response. Resistance fighters also guided paratroopers and with flashlights, and some even joined the paratroopers on their mission. And when the sun rose on June 7th, 1944, the Allies have formed a beachhead and began moving inland. The French resistance has begun the liberation of France. The French resistance continued to fight with the Allies even after D-Day. On August 20, 1944, the resistance fighters liberated the town of Toulouse, France, and just 5 days later, on August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. The resistance fighters have accomplished their goal and achieved victory. Charles de Gaulle entered a liberated Paris on August 26, 1944. As he made his way around Paris, he was surrounded by plenty of citizens who admired his hard work. Then, he performed a speech saluting Paris and the effort it took to liberate it. The French resistance is remembered in many ways by the French people, especially Charles de Gaulle. In Paris, he has an international airport named after him and a statue of him. His appeal of 18th June is remembered in a memorial in Ouistreham. It is considered one of the best speeches of all time by the French people. The French resistance shows us how passionate, small, but armed resistance groups can fight a huge military power, such as the Nazi Germany's. And without them, D-Day may have been less of a success or even a failure.